Okay, so the fixed wing power air test and basic proficiency certificates. All right. What we'll start off with is a bit of an overview of some of the requirements to be able to take the test before we move on to the actual test itself, and we'll talk about every section of the test. By all means, if you've any questions, type them into the chat box as we've discussed, and raise your hand, and then Duncan or one of the other ASRC guys will stop me in full flow, and we'll bring the question in. Okay. So, right, first of all, I'm going to duck straight out because Kevin wanted to say something. So, Kevin wanted to talk about certain elements here on the overview. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you very much for that, Andy, and good evening to everybody. This slide is a new slide. It came about as the result of a few comments that were made after the last Zoom meeting that we had. And it's important to understand that the preparation and schooling for any of the tests depends on these elements that you can see in front of you on this screen. The instructors have a role: explanation, demonstration, evaluation of the candidate. The examiners have a role: pre and post-test explanation, evaluation. Good idea in there to throw a mock test in. You can do a lot there, you can learn a lot from that. The role of the candidate: you've got to be aware of the test. You've got to be aware of the requirements, the standards, and that does include safety and knowledge of legislation. So there's quite a lot there for people to do. But please don't forget that help and guidance from all of these above is available from the ASRC, your area chief examiners, club officials, and there is obviously achievement scheme publications and videos there to look at as well. So it's just a bit of an overview that we mustn't forget there's a lot of work goes into it before you actually start the test. And with my little introduction, I'll hand back to Andy.
Thanks, Kevin. So, yes, moving on. Yeah, the BPC, the Basic Proficiency Certificate, or the A certificate, basically, if you want to take the test, you need to apply to any examiner, any club examiner, any chief examiner can take anybody for any of the A tests. So that's the first thing you need to know. And the candidate has, he must complete the test all in one go. He can't do half the test and then come back the following day to finish it or anything like that. It's got to be done in one attempt. Manoeuvres in the order that they are written in the standards booklet, and you get 2 attempts in a day. Okay, it's quite often the case that the nerves take over on the first attempt, and sometimes they need to go away, gather the senses a bit, and then they'll come back and they'll fly really well on the second attempt. I always suggest as well, if a candidate hasn't already had a flight before he's doing the test, it is definitely worth doing. Okay. Right, so this is a question that crops up quite regularly: A certificate or BPC, and what are the differences? They are both measures of flying ability, which may be equated to a solo standard of flying, and we say they may. As you can see, approximately 50% of clubs use these tests as their solo test. It's not an unreasonable thing because it just happens to be set at the perfect level to do that. But it's not a requirement from our point of view. The Achievement Scheme Review Committee and the BMFA in general consider all the achievement scheme tests as a measure of personal achievement. Okay, they don't infer any rights whatsoever. And it's quite important to realise that there's actually no difference whatsoever in the test itself for the A certificate or the Basic Proficiency Certificate. It is identical. Same questions, same pre-flight checks, post-flight checks, and the same flying manoeuvres. So it's worth talking about what or why you will be awarded one as opposed to the other. First of all, for an A test, your aircraft has to be capable of taking off from the ground. Okay, so if you turn up for it with an aircraft without an undercarriage, you will be awarded a BPC on successful completion of the test. We also have a lower weight limit for the A test. So if your aircraft is under 1 kilogram, you can only take the basic proficiency certificate. The other thing is the electronic stabilization. Again, if there's any extra electronic piloting aids, you can only take the basic proficiency certificate. So if you turn up with a model that can take off from the ground, it weighs more than 1 kilogram, and it doesn't have any form of electronic stabilization, on successful completion of the test, you'll be awarded an A certificate. So hopefully that's all fairly clear. Talking about the model, this is a question that certainly I field quite regularly, and I suspect Duncan and some of the other examiners and chief examiners that are on board get this quite regularly. Does it matter whether it's internal combustion or electric? And it doesn't. Equally, it doesn't infer. The question we get asked is, if somebody takes an A certificate on an electric model, does that mean he can't fly internal combustion? As I've already mentioned, passing the certificates doesn't infer any rights as far as the BMFA and the Achievement Scheme Review Committee are concerned. Okay, so from that point of view, if clubs do, that's a matter for the clubs, but I'm not aware of any that do. If it is an electric model, it's very important to remember that as soon as you plug your battery in, you should be considering it as live. Assume the propeller is going around very, very fast. And with any of our achievement scheme tests, it is important that the model you turn up to take the test with is actually capable of flying all the manoeuvres. What we don't sort of accept as any sort of an excuse, and not particularly relevant on the A test because there's nothing over exciting, shall we say, on that. But you know, if somebody turns up for a B test with an aircraft that won't do the outside loop or won't spin, they can't use that as an excuse for not doing very well on those manoeuvres. Okay, and this next slide, it's one of those things that you wouldn't have thought we would have to put in the standards booklet, but we did. After we heard of one particular individual who was charging people to teach them how to fly, and at the end of it, whenever he was taking them for a test, he would have them on a buddy lead because they were using his aircraft, and if something went wrong, he didn't want his aircraft damaging. So not entirely sure that suggests a great confidence in his teaching ability, to be honest. So we added that to all the guidance. So you cannot take the test if you're using a buddy lead, which I don't believe is unreasonable. So now I mentioned about the A test, and your aircraft has to be capable of taking off from the ground. There is a bit of a caveat to that. If the ground isn't capable for taking off from the ground, which does occasionally happen, and if the examiner believes that the ground is preventing the takeoff, he can allow a hand launch for the A test. But it is very much a decision for the examiner to make. So you need, if you're taking an A test, you need to be prepared to turn up to be able to take off from the ground. Okay, so moving on to the a bit more about the test. Height, speed and positioning. Test says there should be flown about 100 and 150 feet high. Shouldn't be so high that the model is a spec. That sort of suggests lack of confidence. But equally, we're talking about an A test here, so it doesn't need to be extremely low or anything like that. I tend to tell candidates 3 to 5 houses high, and then that way you get to find out who lives in a penthouse flat as they fly a spec. Another point to notice there, you know, a candidate that flies at full throttle all the way around, they should not pass. They clearly either haven't practiced and it's not at a level suitable for passing. And the crossing manoeuvre should be performed at a consistent, appropriate and safe distance out from the pilot. Personally, there's nothing worse as an examiner having to lean back so you're uncomfortable, you've got your head right back. Do it out in front where we can see it in a comfortable manner. Okay. Yeah. Plus, of course, it takes you further away from the no flying area, which can only be a good thing. So we then move on to the pre-flight checks as required by the BMFA safety codes. I always tell the candidate that they should assume they have just arrived at the field. So they would do everything they would do as they arrive at the field. Okay. So the usual things as you'd expect to, check that the motors fasten properly, the propellers tighten properly, the undercarriage and everything is all secure, all the control linkages and surfaces. And there at the bottom, don't forget a fail-safe check. Certainly in my view, for a fixed wing test, there is no excuse whatsoever for not doing a fail-safe check at the start of a flying session. Personally, I do one at the start of every flight. It is it's an important thing to actually be flying lawfully, is that so? So do a fail-safe check and demonstrate it. Discuss this with your examiner beforehand if you're a candidate. By all means, some radios. I think some of the Spectrum ones, it actually takes 4 or 5 seconds from when you turn the transmitter off before the fail-safe will kick in. That's because when you turn it off, it goes through a boot down sequence. So don't expect the throttle to go to idle or off immediately as they turn it off. But as long as it does after a few seconds, you know you're okay on that one. Okay. Hopefully that's nice and clear for everybody.
Got a hand raised, Andy, from Joseph.
Right. Okay. So if somebody wants to unmute him so I can ask the question. Joseph, have you got a question?
Yeah, I just thought I'd point out I use Spectrum myself, and the more basic transmitters, or not basic, but the non-sort of Android-based transmitters, such as the sort of DX6s and such, they do take a few seconds for the failsafe to kick in.
Yeah.
But if it's one of the more advanced ones, like the IX range, you can turn the frequency off, and so it should just turn off straight away, basically.
Yeah. Okay. I think we've also got a question from Colin.
Yeah, just a quick question here. Is fail-safe mandatory? Because sometimes I fly 35 megs, and there is no fail-safe.
Okay. If you have it, if it's capable, your aircraft is fail-safe capable. Yes, it should be set. If you haven't, so some 35 meg stuff where you just cannot set a failsafe, that's okay. But if it is capable, it should be set to throttle to idle or off as an absolute minimum.
If to jump in really quickly there, Andy, the failsafe is one of the 23 mandatory questions. So anything over 7 kilos, any jet turbine, and any aircraft capable of having a failsafe set.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so even an indoor shop flyer on 2.4 gig, if you're flying that outdoors, you're supposed to have the failsafe set. All right. So moving on then. Right, for the actual test itself then, the pilot should be stood in the pilot's box or your designated pilot area for the entirety of the flight. That means they can't carry the aircraft out and stand behind the aircraft for taking off. Being able to take off while you're stood in the pilot's box is an essential skill that's tested here. Originally, going back a lot of years, you were allowed to stand behind the model, but I think quite rightly it was felt that you're not testing a skill that is required at most flying sites. So that was changed probably about 15 years ago now, I think.
A long time, yeah.
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 So you take off, complete the left or right hand circuit, and then overfly the takeoff area. You'll notice there it says racetrack, rectangular or circular circuit is acceptable. There's nothing defined for the circuit type for that particular one. And it also says there you can carry the model out to the takeoff position. Okay, but obviously you need to come back to the pilot's box before you commence your takeoff. And of course, what you're also going to do if you are going out there, or your assistant is, you're going to make sure that you let anybody else who is flying know that you're going out onto the strip. You're not going to go out there without letting everybody know. And I think I probably forgot to mention it a little bit earlier. It's even though you're almost certainly going to be the only person in the skies for the test, and it is a point I always raise to candidates, you should assume that there are at least a couple of other people flying at all times. So you need to behave as if there are other aircraft in the sky and other people that you're communicating with. Okay. Right, so moving on to the next manoeuvre then, which in my view is the most difficult manoeuvre in the A test, and in some respects the B test as well. The figure of 8. Yeah. And what I'm not going to do at this point, mainly because my throat's very dry and I need a drink, is talk you through this manoeuvre, because you will hopefully have all watched the video. But what I did is pull a little excerpt out from the video, which shows, and we have Peter Willis, who's the former chairman of the ASRC, talking us through this manoeuvre which Duncan was flying.
Figure of 8. This commences as you fly straight along the strip. Then just before your model approaches the centre point of the manoeuvre, which will be straight in front of you and the examiner, you commence the first 90 degrees of the left-hand circle until the model is flying away from you in line with the centre point. Then roll right and carefully complete the 360-degree turn of the right-hand circle. When the model is flying away from you again along the centre point, you bank left to complete the remaining 270 degrees of the left-hand circle.
So I did that yesterday.
The manoeuvre is completed once the model has passed the centre point, flying straight along the strip again. It is quite difficult to see the actual shape of this manoeuvre on video when viewed from the ground. So let's look at that again from above. It's important to remember that the examiner is looking for circles of similar size, as well as the changes in circle direction being straight in front of you both. If there is a strong wind, then the into-wind parts of the manoeuvre may appear to take a little longer to complete, and the now-wind parts a little faster, to maintain the size and shape. You can also see that Duncan had to constantly adjust the bank angle to keep the circles at a consistent size and shape.
Okay, so that I think does describe what the examiner is going to be looking to see quite well there. There are, in my experience, a couple of mistakes that seem to crop up quite regularly when we're doing the tests, and I think probably some of the other examiners on board will have also seen these. The first one that quite often they get wrong, and you should be able to see my line now that we know how to annotate these, is they leave the turn into the middle too late. So they're more or less doing a right-hand turn there. Can you all see that? Nod heads if you can, yeah. So rather than doing the, in effect, a quarter of a circle to take you into the middle, they're doing almost a 90-degree turn. Okay. And the other mistake, and this is one that is very difficult to recover from, and you're almost certainly going to get your figure of 8 wrong if you do this. So coming along into the middle, all well and good, but at that point you just turn too tight, and you see this quite a lot. And what happens is then when you come round in to do it, you miss the crossover point, which you're aiming to get directly in front of you. So that section there, if you get that right, you're almost certainly, if the candidate gets that right, it's almost certainly turns out into a good figure of 8. It's when they turn this bit here rather sharpish that things go wrong. Okay, so I'll clear my drawings off there. Has any of our other ASRC members any common mistakes they want to talk about for the figure of 8?
I think the second one you described there, Andy, is the most common, and the advice I always give to candidates is to take their time. And in fact, that's not a bad bit of advice to give them for the test in general. But all the time when you've made the initial turn, the second part that you've just described, where people get it wrong and turn too soon, is where I tell candidates they can buy themselves space and time, because the models at this point is into wind. So you need to get as upwind as possible to give you the space to adjust the bank so that you can make your intersection point. So that's my observation. But that's for the figure of 8. That's the most common fault that I see. I don't know how the other guys, what their experience is.
Yeah, different size circles, noticeably different, and different heights. You tend to lose height at one point, and you get different elevations in the circuit.
Yeah, no, that's. I think the different size circles. You sometimes see these that type of thing, which obviously not. I can't demonstrate the different heights on here, unfortunately.
No, but
Yeah,
it is.
Sorry, go on.
What I always tell the candidates is whenever they're into wind, their bank should be gentle, and whenever they're downwind, their bank should be steeper.
Yeah.
Because it depends on the strength of the wind, but on a particularly windy day, it's very important that they follow that.
Yeah, the two things I see is failing to compensate for wind, and also the 50p piece effect, where they do multiple small turns rather than one smooth circle.
I think some advice I generally always give the candidates is to fly it as big as they can. Use the space that you've got. It gives you time to correct as you're going round. Then, if you fly a really tight figure of 8, if it starts to go wrong, there's just no time or no chance for you to recover it. So if you don't fly at full throttle, but fly 2 big circles, and then the chances are that they're going to be able to recover from it. So moving on from the common mistakes of the figure of 8. After this, you're flying right. Somebody we're getting a lot of feedback from. I think it's you, Brian. I'm going to mute you.
Yeah, it's Brian.
Yeah, it was Brian. Yeah, sorry, Brian. Nothing personal. Right. Yes. So we then come in for the landing part of the test, or the first landing, which the circuit is defined on this. It's defined as a rectangular circuit and approach, and use appropriate use of the throttle, and perform a landing on the designated landing area. Obviously, this is an air test, so we're not looking for that perfect touchdown directly in front of the pilot. I think you've got 30 meters either side of them on there. But as an examiner, generally what we're looking for is a safe, controlled landing, nicely on the nice mown bit of strip that you've got. Okay, and as it says there, don't forget to call landing. Even if there's nobody else flying, assume that there is. We're wanting to see you fly as if there are other people flying.
Oh, Andy, we just had a really good observation from David Hope with regard to the figure of 8, and it's something I would certainly support. He says it's actually more about competency than perfection, and that's certainly very true at a certificate level.
Yeah,
I want to be confident that the guy's in control of the model all the way round, rather than the perfection of the shape. When it comes to the B, because it's a relatively simple maneuver, I'm expecting a B certificate candidate to fly it to a much higher degree of precision. But I think that's a very important observation. It's about competency rather than perfection. Sorry, Absolutely. Andy, carry on.
No, that's a very good point. Well raised. One thing on the guidance we did actually change going back 7 or 8 years, because the guidance actually gave you the impression that you could, if you wanted, fly a lazy 8. Which is not what the intention ever was. The intention was it should have been the figure 8, but for the air test, that you can accept that crossover point not being directly away from you. So what we actually had was people turning up to do an air test intending to fly a lazy 8. So the guidance was corrected to make that clear. Okay. So after you have landed, obviously, if it's a good landing, you can taxi and get ready to take off again. If the landing was a bit rough, as an examiner, I'd be wanting to see the candidate think about doing a bit of a check, making sure everything's still safe to take off. If he does a terrible or a very rough landing and doesn't then do a bit of a test of the check of the aircraft, you'd be considering whether they should pass or not. So they can either taxi or the aircraft can be positioned for the takeoff again, which is the same as previously. So you would take off and then complete the circuit, which again, it isn't defined what type of circuit, and overfly the takeoff point. After that, you then move to the rectangular circuit in the opposite direction to the takeoff and landing circuit. So, which I think Duncan's got a few points to make on this one. I think
Well,
the
it's
slide's
just
in the wrong order as well.
rectangular circuits in general. Hang on a second. Rectangular circuits in general. The common mistake I see is it's flown as a triangular rather than a rectangular circuit. So on the downwind leg, let me see if I can get view options. Let's do annotate. Okay, so let's do fat area. So what actually happens is after the hold on, I need to get rid of this. After the candidate's made the downwind turn, this leg slowly creeps in to a point here where we're left with no real base leg. So that it just ends up as one gentle turn all the way round onto final. I used the wrong type of line there, but I hope everybody can understand. What I tell my candidates to do, or trainees to do, is to, on the downwind leg, look for the underside of the aircraft's wing, particularly if it's a high wing model, the bottom of the far wing. If you see that occasionally on the downwind leg, you're pretty sure you'll have flown a parallel rather than a triangular circuit. So I don't know if anybody else has any other observations on what goes wrong in rectangular circuits.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you on that. That is the sort of the common one that you see. Quite often the legs at the end, they do very, very short, which again, use the space that you've got, I always suggest. All right. Okay, so as I say, I think we've actually dropped that slide in a little bit earlier than I was expecting, because at that point we're going to talk about the takeoff, which I've already done. So although that rectangular circuit does come in for the landing circuits as well, of course. So yeah, there is a rectangular circuit required that is the opposite direction to the takeoff circuit. So once they've taken off there, they're going to have to position themselves to be able to fly in the opposite direction of circuit. You will, of course, as an examiner, make sure that the candidate has checked to make sure it's safe to fly the opposite direction circuit and announce those intentions. Okay.
Andy, we've got a question about the from Martin Round about the is the candidate, with regard to the landing circuit, is the candidate allowed to go around again for no obvious reason? And he says just if they just don't feel comfortable with the approach, and if so, how many times?
Right, it's
a bit double-edged that, but I'll let you say, have your say first, Andy.
If he's going round for no obvious reason, you've got to ask why. Generally, I would suggest there should be an obvious reason, and one of those reasons could be they have just got it wrong. Not lined up correctly and not happy with it, and what you would want the candidate to do at that point is to go around. If you're not getting it right, don't force it down. That's more dangerous than the go around.
Yeah, and I think a degree of self-awareness is a good sign.
Yes, absolutely. It's that is what we're looking for.
But there is a but, of course.
Yes, if they need half a dozen attempts to get it down onto the short grass, clearly they haven't practiced enough. No. You could allow one if the conditions were really shocking. Potentially even 2 attempts. But beyond that, I think the candidate needs to go away and practice a bit more.
Because it actually ties in with in Tuesday's presentation, we had somebody ask, well, how often would you allow a candidate to repeat a particular manoeuvre? And I think the general consensus amongst the examiners that were taking part was, if you've had to ask for a manoeuvre to be repeated more than once, or if you've had to ask for 2 manoeuvres to be repeated, then you're probably on the borderline of thinking that the candidate isn't ready. We've got another question from Colin Upshur.
Yeah.
If I can
Colin?
unmute you, Colin.
Should be able to mute
Yep,
himself.
thank you very much.
There you go.
Sorry, I would have typed it, but I started typing and I got it all wrong.
I understand. It's not a problem. That's what the raise of hands for. Don't worry.
Right. My question is that I've been on the flying field and I've heard individuals calling their intention, but there doesn't seem to be any consistency of what they're calling and how often and where they should make the calls. Is this documented somewhere?
Not for the achievement scheme, no.
There isn't anything laid down as to what the calls should be. They need to be clear to everybody else that is flying. So, you know, if he's coming in on an approach and landing, whatever the call is made, it should be clear to everybody else that that's what's happening. I'm trying to think.
Yeah, we're not prescriptive about what words people use. Obviously, we recommend that people say dead stick when it's a dead stick landed, and that's the common phraseology. But really, it's the communication is the important thing, and that's something that changes very much with individual circumstances. You know, if there's only a few people flying, it's very different to if there's large numbers of people flying different types of model at different parts of the circuit. So I think it's a very variable thing, but generally communication, you can't criticize it. You almost can't over communicate, but I'm sure it's possible if you really try, but hey, yeah. So no, there's no prescriptive dialogue that has to be used.
No. I think a very valuable point to make on this is when you know, if you're calling landing, you should expect a response from the other people in the pilot's box that are flying. Don't assume they've heard from you, and it is something that I always find rather annoying, where you don't get the acknowledgement from the other people flying. You really should, because how do you know it's safe to land if they don't let you know?
Yeah, how do you know that people have heard you, for example?
Exactly, yes. So, you know, that's a good point for instructors when you're going through this with potential candidates, you know, in the lead up, in the weeks leading up to the test. Ask the candidates when they make a call, if they're not getting a response from the other people, you know, make the call again and, you know, and ask, you know, have you heard me? Otherwise, you know, potentially you've made a call. If you assume everything's okay, it may not be.
Does that help?
Many thanks.
Okay.
Yep, that's fine.
Okay. Right, so after the opposite direction rectangular circuit, we move on to the simulated dead stick. This is something I will always talk about in the pre-flight briefing with the candidate, and point out to them that this is a test. They're not having to pay to take the test. If they're getting it drastically wrong on the dead stick and they're able to throttle up and abort, it's not worth crashing your aircraft over. Okay, so and as an examiner, I will always I'm not going to take them a long way downwind and then say, right, cut your throttle. It's going to be at an appropriate place that gives the candidate chance to get it down safely, hopefully on the short stuff. But I think Duncan likes to chip in at this one.
Yes, I mean,
the
other point I always make is that, and I brief my candidates that the test calls for the dead stick landing to be made on the runway to demonstrate that the candidate has that degree of precision in terms of putting their model down where they want to put the model down. But the most important point that I try and get over is that the runway isn't necessarily always the safest place to dead stick a model. There will be circumstances that they'll come across in the real world where they're faced with the dead stick and they either can't get back to the circle, or there may be other activities on the landing area that mean actually it's much safer if they put the model down somewhere else. So I just don't want people to get into the blinkered assumption that landing back on the runway in front of themselves is always the best thing to do, because there will be circumstances where almost certainly it's not the safest thing to do. But for the test, they have to be able to show they've got that degree, that precision of control to be able to put the model down where it is safe. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Well made, Duncan.
Okay.
So yes, so they, as an examiner, we'll have them a few hundred feet up in the air, somewhere reasonably sensible, and we would say, we'd say to the candidate, right, dead stick. We're expecting the candidate to then call dead stick to communicate to everybody else, and then do his simulated dead stick landing.
Andy, we've
yes.
got a question from Ian Nelson.
We have indeed. You have to unmute yourself, Ian.
I'm trying to unmute him, but it's not working.
Yeah, you'll have to unmute yourself, Ian.
Yeah, there we go.
How about that? All right.
Yep.
Yeah, a few people on the dead stick. It's quite funny, really. Is that once you've gone dead stick at 200 feet, they want to show me about their prowess of how far it can glide in a rectangular circuit before they actually get it on the deck.
Yes, that's not not the object of the exercise.
No, exactly. In the brief beforehand, what I tend to tell the guys when I'm instructing or pre-examining is that to perform a descending circle like you do in the scale competition, it's basically to get your aircraft down on the ground as soon as possible and not, display your prowess at trying to glide your aircraft and then you run out of steam.
Yeah.
That's a good point, Ian. Thank you.
I quite often tell candidates, particularly on windy days, not to actually go downwind of themselves, to just fly backwards and forwards across wind so that they don't actually take themselves too far downwind.
Yeah.
But hey-ho.
Yeah. Okay, so after our successful simulated dead stick landing, the model may well be that, of course, you haven't got the propeller spinning anymore, so it's out in the middle of the strip, so that needs to be removed. If it's electric, you could always taxi it back to a safe area, or if the engine is still running, if it stayed on idle, okay. So you need to safely remove the model and equipment from the takeoff and landing area. Of course, remembering that the candidate is going to yell out to everybody else that is going out to fetch it, if that's the case. And we have a question there. Will you be taking your transmitter with you? It's a question that crops up quite regularly and does create a fair amount of discussion in various places. And it certainly used to be the case before the 2.4 gigahertz radios became common that you wouldn't be taking your transmitter on 35 megahertz out with you. There is a possibility if somebody overflies you, that you could get some interference there that creates problems on 35 megahertz. It's not generally an issue with 2.4 gigahertz, so it's not a particular issue if the candidate takes his transmitter out. And potentially it could be safer for them to do that. Okay, but it is something that you would expect to discuss as part of the pre-flight briefing. Hopefully your candidate's aware enough if he's doing something out of the ordinary or that he thinks might not be what the examiner's expecting. It's the sort of thing they should be discussing in advance. Okay.
I think it's worth mentioning there as well, Andy, about club rules can sometimes trump something like that as well. If the club rules say no transmitters on a runway, then let the candidates understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, club rules apply at all times. You cannot make any allowances in the test, or alter things if it's going to be a breach of the club rules. Okay, so we've retrieved our model. We're going to do our post-flight checks. This is another point that certainly 10, 15 years ago, it was always the case that it was receiver off and then transmitter off. Things can be different these days with some radio equipment. And again, it's the sort of thing you should be discussing as part of the pre-flight briefing. So if for whatever reason the candidate is going to be turning the transmitter off first, that you've discussed this, so you're expecting it. Okay, and remember that the flying part of the test hasn't been completed until the model's been retrieved and the post-flight checks have all been completed. And at that point, you then move on to our devilishly hard questions, which they aren't really, it has to be said. Since 2016, we've had the 5 mandatory questions based on the list of what is now 23. It was originally 20, but with the CAA's changes, we had to expand that slightly. The candidate must answer all 5 correctly. at this point, I think it is worth saying you're not expecting word for word parrot style answers. Okay, you're looking for understanding. So as long as the candidate, makes the examiner aware that he has the knowledge and he knows, he understands this, that's all that's required. It's not required to be word for word the answers that are written in the standards booklet. Having said that, the examiner should ask the question as it's written, so there's no confusion, because we've got to remember that all the candidates have read all the questions because it's there in the standards booklet. They're expecting 5 of those questions. I think an examiner to reword them and it's the sort of thing that could create a bit of confusion and catch out a candidate, which isn't particularly fair. So the examiner should read the questions as they are written, but expect answers that aren't necessarily word perfect. Okay. And after the 5 mandatory questions, you move on to the supplementary questions, which are based on the safety codes, club flying site rules. I always make a point of asking a mixture of questions. Make sure some of those questions are based on the flying site rules. And that's the flying site rules of where the test is taking place. Not necessarily, it might not be the candidate's home club. But you're asking this on where the test is taking place. You can also use some of these supplementary questions if you weren't quite happy with some of the mandatory questions answers. If you just feel you want to ensure that his understanding is fully there for some of them. So an examiner may do that. And as you can see there, it says minimum of 5 questions. So if he's not entirely happy that you've expressed the knowledge that you should have, may ask a few more. I think I've asked 9, 10 questions on some occasions, just trying to establish that the candidate has got the required understanding. Okay, so that's the actual questions there. And finally, try not to be nervous if you're taking the test, but it's not an unreasonable thing to be nervous. Examiners will make some allowance for that, but as a candidate, you still have to meet the required standard. So, if nerves get to the point where you're not meeting that standard, you're not going to pass the test. I have occasionally aborted the test part way through because I felt the nerves were too much and it was affecting the candidate. Often in that situation, you abort the test, you say, right, let's have a few trial flights and then we'll come back and have another go later. And more often than not, later on, they're much better. The nerves have settled and they do very well. Yeah, remember it's fun. If you have practiced, it's not that hard, isn't the A test? Okay. Make sure you've read the standards and guidance booklet, because that's what the examiner will be reading and that's what the examiner's expecting to see. Watch the videos, which hopefully you already have, and of course read your member's handbook. And I think that's pretty much it on the fixed wing A test and BPC. So we shall move on to questions, if anybody's got any questions. Anybody any questions? I'll stop sharing at that point.
People may need to unmute themselves, of course.
Yes, you should all be able to unmute yourselves. No questions? Have we answered everything? Excellent.
No, I think a lot of people are still muted.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
Peter
it's too easy at the
Chapman's.
moment.
Peter Chapman's. I've just seen his hand.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Peter.
I've only just started this, Andy, and I'm a little bit confused. I was reading the achievements booklets, and it says that, as you said earlier on, that the aircraft must be able to take off from the ground, otherwise it would be a BPC.
Yes.
But I've also read elsewhere about the A certificate for the aircraft that I'm flying at the moment, by the way, is a Phoenix with a pusher air screw. Is that not the silent flight electric?
It is the silent flight electric.
Yes, I would think that's probably more appropriate for the silent flight electric test, which doesn't have the either the minimum weight limit or the requirement for rolling off the ground takeoff.
Okay.
So you could take silent flight electric as opposed to BPC.
As long as the aircraft is capable of flying all the manoeuvres in the silent flight electric, yes.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Any more questions? I think Martin Round has got a. There's a point he made in the chat. We were talking about the leaving the transmitter behind from that one.
Yes.
No
yeah.
problem.
Do you want to say any more on that, Martin?
Well, I've got another question actually.
Okay.
If you're an examiner, but you're also the person who's instructed a person, taught them to fly, would you advise that you get a different examiner to take the test? Or don't you think it matters?
I mean, yes, if that would be the ideal. It's not against the rules for the instructor to also be the person that examines the candidate at the end of the day. But wherever possible, we would always suggest that just for independence and impartiality and how it will appear to other club members,
Exactly,
or whatever,
for
would be better if it could be seen to be more independent, as it were.
Yeah.
But of course, if there are circumstances where clubs might only have one examiner, for example, so it could be very difficult. So we do. It's not forbidden, but if we can avoid it where we can, that'd be good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
What I've done in the past for